Welcome back to the third session of the lesson Nationalism in India. So, in the last class, we did talk about the Congress session conducted at Nagpur in December 1920, where a kind of compromise was reached and the non cooperation movement was adopted. Now, from here, we'll pick up for today's class as to how did the movement unfold. Which movement I'm talking about? Definitely, it's the non-cooperation movement. We also need to look into who participated in the movement. How did the different social groups conceive the very idea of non-cooperation? So we look into as to what was the design of the movement in the towns, in the countryside, in the plantations, and what role the different social groups and the categories they played as participants and also as leaders at some or the other point of time. So let's get started and let's start our discussion on the movement in towns. If you talk about the movement in towns, in the movement, when you talk about the very concept of the movement in towns and how did the movement spread in the towns, we talk about the participation on part of the middle class. Okay, so the middle class basically started the movement. So here you see thousands of students, teachers, headmasters, all of them, they left the government controlled schools and colleges. So if you talk about, the students, the teachers and the headmasters, they left the government controlled schools and colleges. That means they left the schools and colleges that were run by the colonial government. The lawyers, they gave up their legal practice. So this is how people participated in the movement. Okay, they did not want to be associated with anything and everything, or anything linked and connected with the colonial government at that point of time. The council elections were boycotted in many provinces except for Madras. So we in the last class, if you remember, we did talk about the boycott to the elections. Okay, the elections for the legislative councils, and these council elections were boycotted in many parts except that in Madras. Now Madras becomes a very special case because we talk about the Justice Party in Madras, and the Justice Party was basically the party of the non-Brahmins, and they realized that yes, they entering into the legislative council was a way out for them of gaining some kind of power, some kind of political power. I mean, if you talk about the Brahmins, if you talk about the Brahmins occupying the highest position in the society. So they realized that yes, this was one way as to how they could also gain some kind of political power. So Madras is a special case, and Justice Party absolutely has to be mentioned in this context. So you should remember this point for your MCQs and objectives as well. Moving to the next part of the slide, we talk about the effects of the non-cooperation movement on the economic front, and absolutely the effect was more dramatic. How do we talk about the economic front and how do we connect with the economic scenario and the kind of economic impact it had? For example, if we talk about foreign goods, they were boycotted, we are aware. The liquor shops were picketed, the foreign cloths were burned. Okay, so we had the huge bonfires of the foreign cloth. So you see a kind of boycott of the foreign products in terms of goods, in terms of clothes especially. And when all this was happening, definitely the import of the foreign cloth halved between 1921 and 1922. So something which was worth 102 crore absolutely dwindled down to decline to 57 crores. Okay, just within a span of what is called only 1 year. In many places, you had the merchants and the traders, they refused to trade in the foreign goods or finance foreign trade. So this is how the different classes, the different categories were supporting the non-cooperation movement. You had these merchants and traders, they refused to trade in the foreign goods and they refused to finance the foreign trade. If you talk about the boycott movement spread and people actually began discarding the imported clothes and wearing only the Indian the Indian clothes and the one produced in India, and that actually increased what is called the demands of the Indian cloth. That means, yes, the production on part of the Indian mills and the handlooms went up. So a kind of boycott of the foreign cloth, a kind of um, you know absolutely organizing the bonfires of the foreign cloth, and then something which was Indian was preferred, was something which was Indian, something which was manufactured by the Indians was preferred and was worn by the public on a very large scale. So you see a kind of increase in the production in context of the Indian mills and then the handlooms also. So this is how the scenario changed, and definitely we have talked about the kind of decline in context of the value of the imports as well, from 102 crores to 57 crore. So these important points you have to keep in mind while writing the very story of the movement in terms. The production of Indian textile mills and handlooms went up when people started boycotting the foreign goods. That was very, very logical when the foreign goods were boycotted, when the foreign supplies in context of the clothes were boycotted. That means the Indian textile and the handlooms, they received a kind of boost. Okay, and then the production went up. So this is also going to lead to some kind of employment, and it is also going to promote some kind of employment in context of the Indians especially. So this is how the movement was designed in the towns. But the point is, did the movement continue for a very long period of time? If it could not continue for a very long period of time, what was the reason as to how it slowed down? It slowed down due to a variety of reasons, such as khadi clothes. If you talk about, they are more expensive. So people could not afford, or less number of Indians could just afford, the expensive khadi cloth. Okay, so this is one point to be kept in mind. Other important point is less Indian institutions for students and teachers to choose from. For example, we did talk about that, yes, how the students, the teachers and the headmasters, they were leaving the government owned schools, colleges and other institution. Now there is a kind of difference between what was owned by the government and what was owned by the nationalist. I'm talking about pre-independent era. So what was owned by the nationalist here means, I'm talking about again, the leaders here. Fine. So very less number of schools and colleges existed. Okay, for people to be associated with, for the students and the teachers to be associated with, and less number of national schools and colleges. So this point has to be kept in mind while writing the content on the movement in terms. And when there were less number of schools and colleges, definitely people did not have the option but to again get back to the government schools and colleges. And the lawyers also, they joined back the government courts. So this is a kind of drawback. This is a kind of disadvantage. This is a kind of gap here which we are talking about. That is, the movement absolutely, faded somewhere in the towns, in the cities, for different set of reasons. One reason is khadi was expensive for the commoners. Second reason is less number of national schools and colleges. And the third important point is even the lawyers, they gave initially they gave up their practice, but they had no option but to join the government courts. So I hope this slide is clear to you. Please go through the slide, and you may get a separate question on the movement in terms. So we talk about the very concept of boycott and bonfire as well, and we talk about the promotion of khadi, as you can see in the screen. I just tried to put some images for you. Okay, now if you see this image, you can just figure it out that I'm going to talk about the kisans, I'm going to talk about the farmers here. And when we talk about the kisans and the farmers, we connect it with the countryside. That means I'm talking about rural India. So here is this particular slide on rebellion in the countryside. So we talk about one important center, Awadh. In Awadh, Baba Ramchandra led the movement against the talukdars and the landlords who demanded high rate of rent and a variety of other cesses from the peasantry class. So we talk about the peasantry class and how the peasantry class was exploited by these talukdars and by these landlords. And these peasants, they had to pay high rent and also, some increasing amount of fees to the landlords and the talukdars. So basically, this is the way how they were exploited. So you have one important personality emerging at this point of time in Awadh. He's Baba Ramchandra, and he is leading the movement in the countryside. And he is basically standing and taking a kind of position, and he's leading the rebellion in the countryside for the peasantry, and because he wanted to check this kind of exploitation in the countryside on part of the talukdars and the landlords. Now, if you talk about the peasantry class, they also did forced labor or begar. What is begar? That means they were doing some kind of labor without any kind of pay. So, the peasants had to do some kind of labor without any kind of pay. And this is also something which offended Baba Ramchandra as a leader and also the peasants on the whole. The peasant movement demanded reduction of revenue, abolition of begar, and social boycott of oppressive landlords. Very, very logical. That is, if you talk about the peasantry class, how were they exploited? They were paying high rent. So, yes, they demanded what? Reduction in the rent. They were doing begar, so they wanted abolition of begar. And they absolutely wanted to do away with the very existence of the landlords, the exploitative landlords. So social boycott of the oppressive landlords. So these were basically the demands on part of the peasantry class under the leadership of Baba Ramchandra. So we have the Awadh Kisan Sabha, which was set up, which was headed by Jawaharlal Nehru and others. And within a month, you have 300 branches of this Kisan Sabha, which is set up by the villages. So this is one important development coming up, and we need to take care of this. We need to understand, this is very important indeed, because you talk about many branches of this Kisan Sabha coming up. In 1921, the peasant movement was spread, and the houses of the talukdars and the merchants were attacked, the bazaars were looted, and the grain boards were taken over. Whenever a rebellion takes place, no matter the ideology of Gandhiji was definitely that yes, every program had to be non-violent in nature. But gradually here also we see how did the movement also how did it become violent rather. So if you talk about the peasantry class, they were exploited, fine, clear. Then they wanted a kind of freedom from this kind of exploitative existence of the talukdars and the landlords. So you see the houses of the talukdars and the merchants, they were attacked, the bazaars were looted, and the grain boards were taken over. So you see how the peasantry class is leading the movement, because they wanted their rights back with them, and they never wanted to to be controlled by the talukdars or the landlords. The tribal peasants interpreted the message of Mahatma Gandhi and the idea of Swaraj in another way. So you have the tribal peasants, and they also looked up to Gandhiji and the very idea of Swaraj. The colonial government had closed large forest areas, preventing people from entering the forest to graze their cattle or to collect fuel, woods, and fruits. Tribal peasantry at that point of time was dependent on the forest cover for the supply of the raw material and also for the source of their livelihood. This is to be very clear. Please keep this concept in your mind while reading this slide, that yes, the tribal peasantry class was dependent on the forestry for their source of livelihood. Now the colonial government comes up with the acts and the rulings that prevented the people from entering the forest. So if the tribal peasantry was not allowed to enter the forest, how will they manage their livelihood? How would they earn a kind of living? So they were not allowed to enter the forest, they were not allowed to graze the cattle, they were not allowed to collect any raw material, they were not allowed to collect fuel, woods, and fruits for that matter. So this irritated and agitated the tribal peasantry class. And then absolutely we see a kind of agitation here building up. Now, if you talk about the early 1920s, you have a militant guerrilla movement which was spreading in the Gudam Hills in Andhra Pradesh. And this guerrilla movement in the Gudam Hills in Andhra Pradesh was led by Alluri Sitaram Raju. Now, this personality claimed that he had a variety of special powers, and he asserted that India could be liberated only by the use of force. So, you have so many development happening in the countryside. Firstly, we did talk about Baba Ramchandra. We did talk about Begar. We did talk about high rent of revenue. Secondly, we did talk about the Awadh Kisan Sabha. Then we talked about how the movement turned violent. The talukdars and the merchants, they were attacked, the bazaars were looted, the grain boards were taken over. We also talked about the tribal peasantry class. They were not allowed to enter the forest. They could not take their animals for grazing. They could not collect the raw material and the fuel, wood and the fruits. Now, parallel to this, another development is happening. A militant guerrilla movement was started and it was spreading in the Gudam Hills in Andhra Pradesh. So this movement was basically led by Alluri Sitaram Raju, and people believed, and he also claimed to have some special powers with him, and people also believed the same. And he asserted, he made a point that yes, India could only be liberated, India could only get freedom by the use of force and nothing else. So we have to keep Alluri Sitaram Raju in mind whenever we are talking about the Gudam Hills. So if you talk about Awadh again, peasants were led by Baba Ramchandra. And just to elaborate more on Baba Ramchandra, he was a sannyasi who had been earlier to Fiji as an indentured laborer. So he had a kind of experience as to what is the real face of exploitation like. The movement here in context of India was against the talukdars and the landlords. So we have just talked about it, that this was all against the talukdars and the landlords who demanded what? High rate of rent and other fees from the peasantry class. And peasants had to do begar. Begar means any kind of labor without pay. So they were working on the landlord's land without any kind of payment. And as tenants, they did not have any security of tenure, and any time and every time, they could be asked to leave the land. They did not have any right over the leased land. So first of all, the peasantry was working on the landlord's land. He was also doing begar without any payment, and then any time and every time the peasantry was to leave the land. So there was no security of tenure, by the way. The peasant movement, if you talk about on the whole, for Awadh, the peasant movement demanded what? Reduction in revenue, abolition of begar, and social boycott of the oppressive, definitely the peasants. So in many places you had the Nai Dhobi Bands. They were organized by the panchayats to deprive the landlord of the services, even of the barbers and washermen. Please understand, in the beginning I did talk about the very concept of social boycott. How the peasantry class was to socially boycott the talukdars and the landlords by not providing any services to these talukdars and the landlords. So the Nai Dobi Bands were organized. That means the Nai service was not to be given to the talukdars and the landlords. The Dhobi service was not given to the talukdars and the landlords. Understand, I'm talking about the barber service and I'm talking about the washerman's service. So in June 1920, you have Jawaharlal Nehru, who began, taking rounds of the villages in Awadh, and he tried his best to understand the grievances on part of the peasantry class. By October, the Awadh Kisan Sabha was set up, and Baba Ramchandra also was there along with him. So within a month, we talk about 300 branches that were being set up in different parts of the region. And absolutely, the non-cooperation movement was seeing some kind of success, and the efforts on part of the government, on part of the Congress basically, was to integrate the Awadh peasantry struggle into a wider struggle, because congressmen saw that this was a kind of success and it involved a lot of peasantry I mean, it involved the peasantry class on the whole, which was one majority class in the country. So this is how the peasant movement was to be integrated, into with the national movement in a wider form, and the idea was to turn the peasantry struggle into a wider struggle, and uh, definitely we have to keep in mind the very contribution on part of Baba Ramchandra or Alluri Sitaram or Jawaharlal Nehru for that matter. So the peasant movement, however, developed in forms that the Congress leadership was unhappy with, and as the movement spread in 1921, the houses were attacked, the bazaars were looted, and the grain hoards were taken over. So in many places, uh, local leaders told peasants that Gandhiji had declared that no taxes will be paid, and the laws and land was to be redistributed amongst the poor. So this is how people started believing, and this is how people started considering Gandhiji as the leader, and then actually believing that something which was not said or something which was to be said, that yes, Gandhiji has declared that no taxes will be paid and the land absolutely will be distributed amongst the poor section of the society. So rebellion in the countryside has to be studied, keeping in mind the contribution on part of the different leaders, keeping in mind the growth of the movement, keeping in mind the very concept of how the social boycott, also keeping in mind how people started believing in the ideology of Gandhiji and started considering Gandhiji as the leader and declaring on their own part that taxes will not be paid and the land will be redistributed amongst the poor section of the society. The very existence of talukdars and the landlords is something very important which has to be studied in this context, because they played a very important role in actually agitating the whole lot of the peasantry class, and also maybe also that also led to the emergence of the leaders, either in the form of Baba Ramchandra or Alluri Sitaram Raju. So the name of Mahatma Gandhi was being invoked to sanction all action and aspiration. So the name itself was more than enough for people to join the movement, for people to believe in the cause of action of the movement. Thank you.